A very good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Stewart and I'm head of the Department of History at the University of York. It's my absolute pleasure to be hosting this event on behalf of the University of York and York Ideas and in partnership with the Wolfson History Prize. We're here today as part of the University of York's online open lectures series, which is continuing its work despite the different format this year to showcase York as a city of ideas and innovation. And I hope that you are looking forward as much as I am to this evening's presentations and discussion. Before we go on, I just want to make a few technical notes. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button that should be at the bottom of your screen. This is available throughout the talk and you can ask your question at any time. If you have any technical issues, such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Do also remember that today's event is being recorded and you'll be able to watch again on YouTube in a few days' time. Do also use the hashtag #YorkIdeas and you can join the conversation on Twitter. This evening is a celebration. It's a celebration of historians and of the value of historical research. And it's in that celebratory spirit that I want to pay tribute to someone who brilliantly articulated to very wide audiences the importance and relevance of our discipline. Professor Mark Armroad, formerly Director of the Centre for Medieval Studies, Head of History, and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, died in August 2020. I didn't have the privilege of knowing Mark. His illness caused him to take early retirement in the year that I joined this institution. But I know his work, despite the fact that my own area of expertise is some 250 years ahead of the period that Mark made his own. And that's testament not only to the range of Mark's research, but also his extraordinary ability to set out the new agendas and approaches with which all historians needed to engage. Now, I have to say here that my conversations with medievalists invariably throw up the complaint that early modernists never read their work and hence think that they're coming up with dazzlingly new concepts when the medievalists have got there first. Now, we early modernists tend not to believe them, except in the case of Mark Armroad. When I was a postdoctoral researcher constructing a project on state formation, I discovered Mark's early work on English fiscal history. Later, Mark's astonishing output on parliaments, petitioning, and the discourses of politics informed my own thinking on political cultures. Now I'm trying to write on the gendering of political discourse, and I'm adding one of Mark's final studies, Women in Parliament, to my reading list. What inspires me about Mark's work is something that I think is absolutely central to what we do as historians. Yes, we are interested in systems and processes and structures, but Mark's research always put people at the heart of the story. It's people who have to make decisions, who strive to adapt to and make sense of change, who struggle to shape events over which most of us, perhaps all of us, have very little control. Mark Armroad was a medieval historian. There's a lot of talk emanating from certain quarters about how the humanities needs to do more to make itself relevant to contemporary concerns. To put it crudely, some people ask, how are a bunch of academics who are happiest scrabbling about in dusty old manuscripts going to solve the world's problems? Well, look at Mark Armroad's work and it shows us how. The people-centred approach to Mark's research has always spoken to contemporary concerns. He was able to do that most explicitly and directly in his project, England's Immigrants. But it's there in all his work, whether it be about women navigating male-dominated cultures, I know a little bit about that, or the way in which the putatively private matter of our sexualities structures the public discourses through which we understand power hierarchies, or about how even in highly unequal societies, the need for elites to seek consent enables subordinates to exercise agency. Mark's work was unfailingly rigorous in its approach to evidence, critical of received wisdom, even and especially his own wisdom, and unfailingly generous to the views of others. It was also collaborative. In a world beset by seemingly intractable problems, it's these skills, the skills that are intrinsic to the discipline of history, that our young people are going to need now more than ever. Mark has left the University of York with an extraordinary legacy that we all wish to see fostered into the future. And I'm delighted to announce that friends and colleagues at the university have created an appeal for those who wish to give a charitable gift to recognise Mark's contribution to the study of medieval history and to support postgraduate students. We would welcome your support. And if you would like more information, you can just please contact me, Laura Stewart, and I'll be able to put you in touch with relevant parties. There's also more information that has been put in the chat for you. But now it's time to move on to the main event, and I'd like to invite Paul Ramsbottom, Chief Executive of the Wolfson Foundation, to open proceedings with a few words about the prize. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much, Laura, and it's a great privilege to be here tonight. I'm very conscious that I stand between the audience and an intellectual feast, so I will indeed be very brief. But I did think that it's worthwhile, by way of introduction, just placing this event in its wider context. The Wolfson History Prize is a book prize that has been awarded each year since 1972 by the Wolfson Foundation. The foundation is, as I suspect many of you know, a charity which funds widely in the fields of research and education. One of the aims of the prize is to celebrate history writing, which on the one hand hits the highest scholarly standards of research, and on the other is highly accessible. And the 6 wonderful authors who were celebrated this year, of whom we have 4 tonight, speak eloquently to that, as do their strikingly brilliant books. But the prize has a wider ambition too, an ambition to encourage debate about history and historical themes. We feel that historical literacy and historical debate are crucial for a healthy society. And so I hope that this evening will be a wonderful example of precisely that. And so let me just conclude by saying that it feels particularly appropriate to be working with the University of York on this. They are a long-standing partner of Wolfson. Indeed, our funding of York's education and the wider cultural organisations in the city go back all the way to the 1960s. And so, although it's sad that we can't gather together in York tonight, this is very much the next best thing, and we're delighted to be joining you for that. So, Laura, I will hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Paul, and of course we're delighted to be working with the Wolfson. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce our chair this evening, Rayanne King. Rayanne is the Chief Executive of York Museums Trust and has worked in the museums and galleries sector for the past 25 years, as well as holding a degree in modern history. She was previously head of Heritage Lottery funding in the West Midlands, and prior to that she was Director of Art Galleries in Liverpool. She has also worked in senior roles in Birmingham and Coventry, where she has led on the commitment to making history accessible to all. And we're absolutely delighted that she's joining us this evening. I'll be returning to say a few words at the close of this event, but for now, Rayanne, it's over to you.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Paul. Thank you to the University of York for putting on these wonderful talks through York Ideas that really do bring public access to scholarship. And thank you, Paul, for this great celebration of history through the Wolfson. I'm really thrilled to be here tonight. Our authors bring a fascinating range of topics from Chaucer to 20th century cricket. And yet, despite that range, there are some overlaps. They all bring a sense of a globe being connected, and they all bring fresh perspectives. In an era of culture wars, the other thing that I find really inspiring in all of these books is the rigorous research and the original use of sources. And that reminds us how important historical evidence is. Our first speaker tonight is Professor David Abulafia. David is Emeritus Professor of Mediterranean History at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Gonville and Caius College. He's a former Chairman of the Cambridge History Faculty and a Fellow of the British Academy, where he chairs the Medieval Studies section. His previous books include Frederick II and The Great Sea, A Human History of the Mediterranean. This Wolfson 2020 prize-winning book, The Boundless Sea, is what we're here to celebrate along with the other shortlisted works. And it is a book that is truly boundless in the enormous time span that it covers, as well as the wide geographical ranges. I will be back to introduce each speaker, but in the meantime, please welcome David, and over to you, David.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to try and explain what I was trying to do in taking on the rather extraordinary task of writing a book that goes back many, many millennia and comes right up to the present day, and which encompasses the whole world, I believe, from a new, a different perspective. And as Rayan said, the title of the Boundless Sea is intended to express something in particular. It's not the boundless seas in the plural. One of the ideas behind the book, which you'll already find in some of those ancient Greek writers, is that the ocean, the okeanos, is actually a single stretch of water. And of course, it encompasses 70% of the surface of the globe. The Mediterranean, about which I've also written, encompasses less than 1%. And having started with the Mediterranean, having looked over many years at this rather small, narrow space across which contact between different civilizations across the millennia has been extremely intense and unceasing, the challenge of looking at the oceans was something of a rather different order. One is looking at very, very large spaces, some of which have never really seriously been crossed by large numbers of ships, for instance. One's looking at the way in which human beings have engaged with the sea. And I want to pick up there a point that Laura made about Mark Armroad, whom I knew many years ago in Cambridge, putting people at the center. So the subtitle of my book, A Human History of the Oceans, it is actually a challenge to a particular way of writing maritime history, a particular way of writing global history, where sometimes the human beings, the individual human beings, rather disappear from the picture. And we owe that to a very great historian who wasn't terribly interested in what individuals did. He didn't really believe that single individuals could, as it were, change the course of history. And that was Fenon Bradel, the illustrious French historian, one of the greatest historians of the 20th century, but someone who saw a sort of determinism in his approach to the past. Now, I just want to share with you a few images to give you some sense of the sort of thing that I'm talking about. And if this works, yes. So I'm going to share with you 3 images which express the sort of issues that I'm trying to bring out. This is a very small object, not particularly valuable object, from around the year 250, a coin minted in Cologne in Germany, which was found in Thailand, along with a great deal actually of Roman objects found in Thailand, Vietnam, and so on, which had traversed what historians now call the Silk Route of the Sea, a route which was far more intensively and far more continuously exploited by merchants than the famous Silk Roads, which periodically connected Eurasia throughout the late antiquity, the Middle Ages. So you ask yourself, how did this object actually get there? What I also wanted to show you was a vase, a Chinese vase made somewhere near Canton, Guangzhou, in the south of China, which arrived in Egypt around the year 1000, probably as a gift to one of the rulers. It's now in the British Museum, very beautiful object. I'm sorry I can't show it to you. that is not by any means unique, because under one of the suburbs of Cairo, an area called Fustat, where we know that in the Middle Ages the Jewish and Coptic Christian merchants lived, at least 700,000 pieces of Chinese ceramics from what we would call the Central Middle Ages have been found. So the sheer volume of these connections is one side of the picture. That tells me, as somebody who dabbles in economic history, obviously something about these interrelationships, but we also have to bear in mind the cultural impact of these connections across space. The way in which we find in medieval Egypt, they tried to imitate the making of porcelain, but they discovered pretty quickly that the sort of earth that the Chinese were using to make their ceramics simply wasn't to hand. They couldn't actually do it, and so their appetite grew and grew. But this is a story which then recurs in later centuries, because we've got the in the 18th century, the passion for chinoiserie, for Chinese objects, which led again to the importation of millions and millions of pieces of Chinese ceramics, the famous blue and white, which then the Dutch did begin actually to imitate reasonably successfully. But cities, I mean, Gothenburg in Sweden founded its fortunes on the tea trade, Chinese tea trade, and on the trade in these Chinese objects. So when we look at these connections right across space, which raises an interesting question, the question of the extent to which we can actually use the term globalization to describe some of these connections, the idea that what is happening in this country, in England or in Sweden, is somehow having a major impact on the economic structures far away, let's say in China. These connections are something which are really fundamental to the history of humanity. And looking at them from a maritime perspective is particularly rewarding. Now, when I say maritime perspective, as I said at the beginning, I talked about the boundless sea in the singular, because one thing which historians have tended to do is they've tended to compartmentalize the seas in ways in which people in the past actually did not necessarily do. They didn't necessarily think about an Atlantic, an Indian Ocean, and a Pacific. They tended to divide them into different sorts of chunks. And you can only really discuss the Indian Ocean in connection also with the South China Sea and the waters of China and Japan anyway. So what I've tried to do in this book, I mean, before Columbus, before Vasco da Gama, before about 1500, one does have to deal with these oceanic spaces separately. But after that, to try and think how they related to one another, to try and think of all those connections. When we talk about the slave trade, we have to remember that there were slaves from Madagascar in the Indian Ocean who were particularly valued in the Caribbean. That is part of the picture. As I've said, when we talk about the Indian Ocean, we have to remember that a lot of the traffic actually went, the traffic out of the famous Spice Islands, for instance, carrying cloves and other exceptionally precious, much in demand substances, which historians of Europe obsess about rightly, because these were very important in the European economy in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. But actually Chinese demand was often much greater than the demand coming from the Islamic world and from Europe. So getting that global picture seems to me something of fundamental importance. I was asked what surprised me most in doing the work for this book, and I have to say that takes me in a different direction. The largest of the oceans, encompassing a third of the world, the Pacific, where Polynesian navigators managed to master the art of navigating across these apparently empty spaces to settle islands physically extremely far apart. And we now know from DNA evidence that probably around about 1100, they even reached South America. That was a rather sort of spasmodic contact, a bit like the Vikings in North America. So their ability to sail these seas actually more efficiently with deeper knowledge of how to handle those seas than the European navigators who came in later is, I think, one of the most impressive achievements in the history of navigation. Right, so my book, to conclude, my book, I think, tries to approach the increasing interest in global history, but from what I hope is a rather different perspective, trying to give that maritime perspective, which, strangely enough, I don't think there is another history of the oceans that goes right back in time, comes right up to the present day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That was absolutely fantastic. I can't believe that you managed to get the whole of a feel of your amazing book into such a short time period and such a short slot. And you've really made us think about how the oceanic world is connected, not least by objects across vast distances, long before our modern concept of globalization. I really look forward to hearing from you in the discussion, David, and I'll just encourage and remind the audience to put questions into the Q&A, which we'll come back to when all the speakers have spoken. Next, I'm delighted to welcome Toby Green. Toby is Senior Lecturer in Lusophone African History and Culture at King's College London. His book, A Fistful of Shells, transforms our view of West Central Africa, and was shortlisted for a number of awards in addition to the Wolfson 2020 History Prize. Those included the Kundal History Prize, the Pius Adesamni Memorial Award, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. A Fistful of Shells was awarded the British Academy's Nayaf Al-Rodan Prize for Global Cultural Understanding and the American Historical Association's Jerry Bentley Prize in World History. It's a fantastic book, and I'm delighted to welcome him. Toby, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rayanne, and thank you also very much to David for his, as you say, amazing way. It's a hard act to follow to summarize such a wonderful book as David's, as you did, David. So over to me, and thank you all for attending this evening. So, A Fistful of Shells. It's a book which has a long evolution in my own history. I've been visiting West Africa since 1995 regularly. First out of interest as a young tourist, then as a journalist, and then since 2002 when I began my PhD as I became a professional historian. And over the span of those 25 years now, one of the things that I couldn't avoid and couldn't escape was that my daily experience working in West Africa, interacting with colleagues and with friends, conducting research, was very, very different to the generic pictures, perhaps, which exist of West Africa, both today and, of course, of the West African past. History as a discipline has tended to follow the dictum of Hegel in the 19th century. Africa is outside history. There is no part of historical consciousness. So, for example, history as a subject is still taught almost entirely in the Western world from the perspective of Africa since the rise of colonialism in the 19th and the 20th centuries. There are very, very few institutions in this country or in any Western country which really focus on African history prior to that time. But this awareness of the African past within Western historical consciousness and outside of Africa, I would say global historical consciousness, is very different to the experience I had as a researcher and to the way in which history is connected to so many experiences in the African continent, what you eat, the language which you hear, historical sites, which are often not very well known outside the country in question. And so that was how and why I just tried to write this book, which is a history of West Africa from before the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, really, starts in the 12th and the 13th century, through to the 19th century, from the lens of economic history. So why did I choose that lens? And there I'm going to tell a story, which is, it's in the introduction to the book. About 8 or 9 years ago, I think it was 2011, I was changing some money in Gambia. I gave my friends 3 50-euro notes. He came back with so much currency that it filled a plastic bag. Now, this is actually, in some countries, quite a normal exchange, a monetary exchange in Africa. It's how things are. It's the inequality of exchange, which we've come to expect. It's been normalized. And as I say in the book, actually, it's often the things which are normalized, which can be the things which are most worthy of our attention as historians. How did they become normalized? How is such an unequal exchange normal? And that is one of the main subjects of the book, because as I say in the introduction also, one of the things which actually binds West African historical experiences together is precisely the process through which that became normalized. So that's the approach that I try to take in the book. And in beginning to examine those enormous questions, the economic questions, I then quickly realized, and through the work of other historians, had to engage with the way in which economic and cultural frameworks are very much connected. Economic transformations are influenced by cultural transformations and vice versa. And so those themes interweave with one another through the book. And that, I think, in a way, takes me on to the question which David touched on, what surprised me about researching the book. And I think if I were to be talking to myself as I was in 2002 when I started my PhD, I would the thing which would most surprise me would be the range of sources, and this speaks very much to what David was talking about. The range of sources which a historian of pre-colonial West Africa engages with. Yes, I use written sources in the book, but I also use oral histories which date back many centuries, music, I use material objects, art and architecture. And these are actually standard historical sources for people who engage with that deep West African past. History is not simply a text, a manuscript, but that the intricate way in which those sources can be used to develop a historical picture. I think it speaks not only to the ways in which West African history has often been marginalized by the discipline of history because it uses sources which aren't deemed to be traditional or haven't been deemed to be traditional. But I think it also speaks to the way in which the book and the reflections on pre-colonial West African history in general, it can encourage historians to reflect on the discipline of history, of what history is as a subject, how the discourse is created, and what stands as a valid source and what does not, and how those judgments, the frameworks of power which lie behind those judgments. And that's something which I think in many ways speaks to all of our speakers this evening and their work. And finally, one of the questions I thought I would touch on is, what is the relevance of the book and of the topic, I think, to a broader discussion of global history. One of the themes of the book is, in fact, how, although within Western historical consciousness and discourse, Africa is often portrayed as being outside history, in fact, Africa has been a global player in history for many centuries, far, in some ways, earlier than one could say that parts of Europe were. David talked about the Chinese porcelain trade to Egypt, and in fact, many of those, that trade also crossed the Sahara, came down the East African coast too. And so that global context is very important. But I think the economic context is also very important. It speaks, as I said, to a process which has been normalized, which is the economic disempowerment of Africa and where that comes from. And it also and the book speaks very much, in fact, to the dimension of credit and how that has had a fundamental role in that process. And of course, speaking today in 2020, in the year of this pandemic, when we see what is happening economically to the world, something which isn't as in the newspapers as much as I would like is the impact that is happening in Africa, and the I would say the reinscribing of the credit relationships, which I examine in this book, is very clear in what is happening in Africa as we speak, and the way in which emergency loans, greater indebtedness are being thrust onto the continent effectively in order to try and recoup some of the awful losses which are happening, and the ways in which, of course, those are being often imposed on the continent by private creditors at exorbitant rates, which will mean that if we think comparatively and over the time period of my book and the time period of today, we see that yet again it will be the African poor who are expected to finance the growth after the pandemic. So the relevance is ever present. So I'll finish there, and thank you very much to Rayanne and the University of York for arranging this event, and to all my fellow speakers.
Thank you, Toby. That's a really fantastic summary again, and those issues that you raise in the book around the economic disempowerment are just so powerful, and it's fantastic to see them elucidated in such detail in your book. I really hope that your book leads to more attention to African history, and your book alone has started to redress that balance, it seems to me. We now welcome Marion Turner, Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford. She's also a Fellow of Jesus College. Her book, Chaucer, A European Life, reveals Chaucer's cosmopolitan world, and it's won the British Academy Rosemary Crawshay Prize 2020, Book of the Year for 2019 for the Sunday Times and TLS, and 2020 New Statesman Book of the Year. Looking forward, something for us to all put in our diaries in 2023, Marion is curating an exhibition on Chaucer to be held at the Bodleian. And I'd also like to just say, as a former student at on the University of York's MA in Medieval Studies, we are delighted to welcome Marion virtually, as it were, back to York. Over to you, Marion.
Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and really wonderful to be invited to speak alongside all these other wonderful panelists. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my biography of Geoffrey Chaucer, Chaucer, A European Life. For anyone who doesn't know very much about Chaucer, the 14th century poet, he had a really extraordinary life. He lived through the Black Death and the huge social change that followed the Black Death. He was a wine merchant's son who went on to work for the king. He was a prisoner of war, a diplomat, an MP. He lived through the Great Revolt of 1381, also known as the Peasants' Revolt, and he lived through the usurpation of the throne in 1399. He was an experimental poet who invented the iambic pentameter and wrote an extraordinary range of texts. Now, Chaucer is often thought of and spoken about as the father of English literature. People have a lot of preconceptions about Chaucer, and I think that might be what sparked my interest in writing a biography. A lot of these preconceptions, I think, are limiting and even misleading. So I wanted to see his life in the round, who he was, what stimulated his imagination, what was the relationship between his life and works. And so I wrote a book structured around spaces and places that mattered in his life, a book that tries to burrow into the real and the conceptual structures of Chaucer's 14th century world. So tonight I'm going to talk a bit about the idea of his Englishness and about some of the ways in which his Englishness was actually fundamentally European. So I'm going to talk first of all a bit about his England and then a bit about his Europe. People are often surprised to hear how embedded in international trade networks and in the flow of goods and people medieval London was, though you might not be surprised if you've already read David's book first. So in Chaucer's London, ships arrived every day. Spices came into 14th century London from as far afield as Indonesia via many middlemen. There was this huge appetite for spices at the time. Some of the other products that were coming into London at this time included wine from Gascony, skins, furs, and leather from Spain, fish, timbers, beeswax, grain, metals from Germany and the Baltic lands, squirrel skins from Lithuania, Poland, and Hungary, and other skins from Russia, Finland, Estonia, glass, paper, and fustian from Italy, sugar, fruits, and alum from the Mediterranean. The shops of London were very cosmopolitan places. And Chaucer was born and brought up in Vintry Ward. So London was divided into different wards. Vintry Ward was one of the areas of the city that bordered the river. So he was brought up looking out onto the River Thames. And Vintry Ward was also the ward of London that had more immigrants living in it than any other London ward at this time. So the environment in which Chaucer lived was very polyglot. He listened to lots of different languages. He heard lots of different tongues and dialects around him. Now, later on in his life, when he was an adult, again, he worked on the waterfront. So he lived over Aldgate at this time, but he worked in the Customs House, which was pretty much next door to the Tower of London. Because Chaucer was the controller of the wool custom. Wool was England's only real trading product at this time. And Chaucer's day job was fundamentally embedded in the movement of goods out of and into England. Now, in his court life, because Chaucer also was a member of the king's household and often worked for the king, again, this was a very international environment. And part of the international nature of courts at this time and great households often came from women, from queens and aristocrats who came over from other European countries. So for the first part of Chaucer's life, the queen was Philippa of Hayno. Now, Hayno is not an independent country anymore. It's now split between France and Belgium. But in the 14th century, it was a place that really punched above its weight. And when Philippa of Hayno came over to England, she brought with her a retinue, including many poets and others. Poets who wrote in French, although they were not themselves French. Such was the movement of languages across different countries. Chaucer's wife also came from a Hayno family. And Chaucer also mixed with Italian bankers and traders. In Parliament, there were huge conflicts in these years about monopolies and perceived preferential treatment being given to foreigners. And there was a lot of xenophobic discourse in Parliament as well. Chaucer's poetry emerged out of European contexts. Most of his important sources and influences were texts written in French, Latin, and Italian. Sometimes he read texts in Latin that had been translated from Arabic. Like any educated Englishman at this time, he was multilingual. All educated Englishmen spoke English, French, and Latin. But Chaucer had the great advantage of also knowing Italian, specifically Tuscan, which enabled him to read texts by Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. And his engagement with their texts really changed what English literature could do, both in form and in content. So England, or Chaucer's part of England, because of course it was not the same for people of different social classes, but Chaucer's England was a profoundly international place. So what about his Europe? So I want to talk a little bit about his travels as well. Because again, from the kind of background that he was in, the kind of jobs that he did, he traveled extensively to Europe. So he made many trips to France. First of all, he went to France in order to fight and was taken prisoner and ransomed. But later in his life, he tended to go to France to talk. And I think he was much better at talking than he was at fighting. He went to make peace treaties in particular and to negotiate. He also went to Italy at least twice. One trip was to Genoa and Florence. To negotiate a wool treaty and to talk to bankers. The other trip was to northern Italy, to Lombardy, to negotiate with the notorious Visconti tyrants in Milan and Pavia. But while he was on these trips, he also saw and experienced all kinds of cultural events and things. So he probably saw Giotto's frescoes and their early experiments with perspective when he was in Florence. When he was in northern Italy, he almost certainly acquired books from the Visconti library, borrowed them, had copies made. But the trip that I want to talk a little bit more about is his trip to Navarre. So in 1366, he traveled to Navarre, now in northern Spain. So again, as another reminder that the map of Europe changes all the time, this is not an independent country anymore. But when Chaucer went there, it was ruled by a king known as Charles the Bad, one of my favorite historical characters, Charles the Bad. And so it's in northern Spain. It's bordered by the Pyrenees. Places like Pamplona are in Navarre. And one of the things that I find really interesting in thinking about Chaucer's trip to Navarre was that when he went there, he encountered Jewish and Muslim communities, as well as the Christian community, which was ruling. So I tried to footstep Chaucer, to follow in his footsteps and go on some of the trips that he went on as much as I could. This is really the coal face of research, you know, going to go on these journeys. So when I went to Navarre, I mean, it was completely fascinating. When I went to Olite, which was the town where his safe conduct was issued, in the palace there, which is now a parador. And I only by being there did I see that the Street of the Jews, the Rua della Giudarea, leads right up to that palace. The Jews abutted the royal palace. They were very important at the court. They had a role in all kinds of ways at Charles's court. And there were the regulations about Jews and Muslims at this time in Navarre were really interesting. So, for example, when proclamations were made, they were made in markets on Thursdays, mosques on Fridays, synagogues on Saturdays, churches on Sundays, in an attempt to make an accommodation for different modes of life. Now, I don't want to be idealistic about this. There were many problems and appalling conflicts at different times. And in other parts of the Iberian Peninsula, of course, you know, terrible things were done to non-Christian communities. But at the time when Chaucer went to Navarre, he did see people of different religions managing to live together, which was something that England was no longer managing since the expulsion of the Jews in the 13th century. So today, I think when we think about Chaucer's experiences, it reminds us that non-Christians have a long European history. Thinking about Chaucer's experience might also remind us that every part of Europe is constituted by international trade, the exchange of goods, of languages, of peoples. And a lot of things in my book obviously speak to the past's relevance to the present day. You know, Toby was just talking about this issue of relevance. In my book, I, for instance, include anecdotes about middle-aged people blaming young people for causing the plague. Also anecdotes about anti-European debates in Parliament, for instance. So I don't think I need to point out the relevance of these things. But with my last minute, I also want to flag, I think, the problems of thinking too much about relevance or about how history relates to modern problems. Because I think we read literature and history not only to understand ourselves and our present moment. It's also important to make leaps of the imagination, not to think of medieval people as just like us, but dressed up. In different historical moments, people have thought about selfhood differently, for instance, about the public and the private, about what it means to be a person, to be an individual in the world. And as thinkers, we need to try to strip away some of our own assumptions, as readers to immerse ourselves in different times and places, to experience the radical difference of the past, to challenge ourselves, to use our imaginations when a mode of life or way of thinking is not accessible or obviously relevant. It's not only the past's familiarity, but also its strange otherness that draws us back in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marion. That's an absolutely inspiring note to end on about the historical leaps of imagination required to understand the past. And you gave us such a flavour of the active, rich life of Chaucer, which comes across so well in the book, and explained how Chaucer's Englishness might actually be European. Thank you. And our final speaker this evening is Prashant Kidambi, Associate Professor of Colonial Urban History at the University of Leicester. Prashant is the author of The Making of an Indian Metropolis, Colonial Governance and Public Culture in Bombay, and he's lead editor of Bombay Before Mumbai. His Wolfson shortlisted book, Cricket Country, An Indian Odyssey in the Age of Empire, tells the tale of a really extraordinary cricket tour and unpacks how sport casts a light on the encounter between the British Empire and Indian society. Over to you, Prashant.
Thank you very much, Rehan. I want to start by thanking the organizers for putting together this event. It's really wonderful to be part of a shortlist which comprises such astonishingly diverse and accomplished books. And I want to thank all my fellow panelists and authors for the marvelous books that they have produced. This event focuses very much on the global dimension of the books that are part of this year's Wolfson shortlist. And so what I want to do is speak to the global themes that are there in my own book, which, as Rehan just said, is really the story of the first ever Indian cricket team, or at least the first team to claim to represent all of India on the cricket pitch in the high noon of empire. And on the face of it, it's a book about sport. But through this book, I try to explore a whole range of themes that go beyond the realm of sport. And so what I want to do today is just speak to the global elements in this book. I should start by saying that the book didn't start off as a project that might have anything to do with global history per se. In fact, when I first conceived of it and first began to do the research for it, it was very much a national story, the story of the first ever Indian cricket team. And I suppose a part of me was interested in this because I assumed that this project to put together the first ever Indian cricket team was part of a nationalist effort to project India on the sporting field. So I was really looking for a nationalist consciousness to mirror perhaps the kind of consciousness that was there in the political realm. I was also drawn to this book because of the absolutely extraordinary cast of characters about whom I'd read before, although the tour itself is a very long forgotten episode in India's cricketing history. And these characters drew me to them because, first of all, the team itself was chosen on the basis of religious identity. So this was a team that had 6 Parsis, 5 Hindus, 3 Muslims. And the stories of these cricketers were really fascinating. For example, 2 of the Hindu cricketers were Dalits. As some of you will know, Dalits are regarded by upper caste Hindus as lying beyond the pale of caste Hindu society. They were known as untouchables, to put that in quotation marks. And here in 1911, the first Indian cricket team had 2 Dalit players, both of them brothers. 2 Dalits have not played for India in all the time that India has been an independent country. Then you had the Muslims who all came from one college, which had been set up to try and reconcile Islamic theology with Western learning. And this was the Aligarh College, set up by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, a prominent reformer. And then you had the Parsis, who are a tiny minority, most of them concentrated in the city of Bombay, and whose participation in Indian cricket today is almost non-existent. And yet, there was a time when the Parsis were the most prominent element in Indian cricket. So in terms of these, and of course, alongside all of them, you had the captain of the team, who was the ruler of the most powerful Sikh state in Punjab, a 19-year-old prince, Maharaja Bhupinder Singh, who had been made the ruler of the state after a great deal of prevarication on the part of his British minders, who were very worried that he would go the way of his father, who was widely regarded as being a figure who would, would given to womanizing and so on. And Bhupinder Singh was basically trying to save his throne, and he uses this cricket tour to try and get into the good books of the British imperial establishment in London. So you had this extraordinary cast of characters, and I thought this book would really be about these characters. It would be, in a sense, about their personal journeys. And through those journeys, I thought I would say something about the making of India as a national cricket entity. So there was very little that was global about this. And yet, as I began to dig deeper and started, looking at the the newspapers of the time and the other primary sources, of which I used quite a bit in this book, it became very clear that to really do justice to this story, I had to place it within a larger framework. So the global dimension almost pushed itself out of the confines of the archive and into my consciousness, as it were. What I want to do today is just to identify these global themes. So there were three that I think are key. First, the project to put this first Indian cricket team together was a very long drawn out affair. It was spread out over 12 years. There were 4 failed attempts. And the context in which that happened, this project tried to take shape, was essentially a global one. It was really the empire of cricket, the wider empire of cricket, that the Indian promoters of this project were trying to insert themselves into. This was a time when South Africa and the Caribbean and Australia were the key cricket playing nations. And cricket promoters in India, especially Indian cricket promoters, wanted to be at that imperial high table, as it were. And in order to do that, they felt that putting together a national cricket team was absolutely essential. Now, this is a project which actually had much longer roots, the idea of sending a cricket team to Britain. But originally, the framing of it was not in terms of the nation, but rather in terms of community. And the first to do so were the Parsis of Bombay, who, as I said, were a prominent element in the early history of Indian cricket. They were the first to take the game in the city of Bombay. And it was the Parsis who first tried to take a cricket team out to Britain. They tried this first in the 1870s. And it also ended up in the first libel trial, a legal case involving Indian cricket. Today, of course, we take this for granted that matters to do with Indian cricket often end up in the courts. But the fact that the first episode in this history happened in 1878 was truly a revelation. But they did succeed. That venture in 1878 failed, but the Parsis did succeed in the following decade, and they brought 2 teams out to Britain. But as their cricketing strength declined, they realized they had to, any future team that went out from India would have to be a multi-community team. And that is how you get, the Hindus and Muslims getting involved. So the project that then began to look at how it was that this idea of India, with comprising of these different Indian communities, took shape. And what became very clear was that the very idea of a tour involving India and Britain needed to be framed with a larger global context of sporting tours in the late Victorian and Edwardian era, when it was very common for teams from Australia and South Africa and the West Indies to travel to Britain. And the project to put together an Indian cricket team was really within this wider global context, as I said. And in a sense, it is this larger global framing that allowed me to rethink this event, not as an episode, the first episode in the making of the Indian national cricket team, in other words, as a national history, but to think of it within this wider imperial and by extension global context. Because in a sense, the cricket playing nations of this time were truly, the range was truly global. So that is one sense in which my story became very gradually, but firmly global in scope. And in the book, I locate India's own national cricket history in relation to these wider imperial developments. The second way in which the global impinges on my story is around the figure of one individual, and that is Prince Ranjit Shinji, who some of you will know was one of the most famous cricketers of his time. He was an Indian prince. Well, he was meant to become the ruler of the principality from which he hailed, Navarre in Gujarat, but he had been adopted and then discarded. His father sent him to England, to study, And at Cambridge, he became one of the most accomplished batsmen of his time. And thereafter, he played for Sussex in the English County Championship. And by the end of the 1890s, he was one of the most famous global sporting celebrities. And as Ranjit became famous and he became this global celebrity, Indian cricket promoters tried to put together an Indian cricket team around him, because it was assumed that Ranjit had evoked so much interest in Indian cricket that any cricket team, Indian cricket team, would have to have him, and obviously as captain, because that would be what would draw public attention to such a team. Now, Ranjit, of course, was approached 3 times, and each time he declined. And that was because Ranjit saw himself as an English cricketer, and he thought that if he led an Indian team to England, there would be a question mark over his national identity, which was always, a subject of controversy. There were many in England who thought Ranjit shouldn't be playing for England in the Test match arena. So the story of Ranjit and the Indian cricket team talks to or addresses many of the themes of migration, displacement, cultural identity, where one belongs, how one should navigate these different worlds of empire and nation. And that too speaks, I think, to very key themes in global history. And the third element of the global in my story is really has a lot to do with the event itself, the actual tour. Now, as it happens in the book, I don't get to the tour until very late because, in a sense, there was so much that was going on that I wanted to pack into this story that I came to the tour quite late. But the last part of the book really focuses on the tour itself. And there too, the global was significant because 1911, the year that the Indian cricket team came out, was an extraordinary year, both in Indian history and in British history. I knew the extraordinary character of the Indian side, the Indian element of the story. But what was truly surprising and astonishing for me was how significant 1911 was in British history. This was a year when, on the one hand, you had an imperial coronation in London. You had a whole range of events celebrating empire, but also events. So you had events like the Festival of Empire and so on, the Imperial Conference. But you also had events which were questioning the empire, for example, the Universal Races Congress. And so these cricketers who arrive from India find themselves, the Indian cricket tour becomes part of this extraordinary global melange, as it were, of people from different corners of the world descending on London. And astonishingly, the Indian cricketers were not the only Indian sportsmen. So the book also tells the story of 3 other sets of sportsmen who arrived in Britain that year. First, you have an aging Parsi rackets player. Rackets is a forerunner of squash, as some of you will know, who was the world champion in his sport. I'd never heard of this figure. It was most sports histories never even mentioned him. But he'd become the world rackets champion in 1903. And I discovered that he was in London in 1911 to defend his crown. And as it happened, he was great friends with a lot of the Parsi cricketers because he was a Parsi. His name was Jamshedji Markar, or Markar being the sort of term that his family had acquired because they used to work in the rackets court back in Bombay. And rackets, incidentally, was the second most popular sport after cricket, I learned while doing my research. Second, you had a whole bunch of, you had 20 plus Punjabi wrestlers who were descended in London, brought over here by a Jewish impresario, who were challenging all the prominent European wrestlers of the day. And when they finally fought matches against these European wrestlers, proved triumphant. And they too were in London that particular year. And finally, you had a man named Kodi Ramamurthy Naidu, who claimed to be the Indian Hercules, who exhibited extraordinary feats of physical endurance and strength. He allowed an elephant to walk over him. He had a car with lots of people sitting on it, sort of going over his body, all these extraordinary feats that were associated with the strong men of the era. So I tell the story of all these individuals, these sportsmen too, who in a sense also competed with the Indian cricketers for public attention. And it alerted me to the fact that the world before 1914 was the first stage of imperial globalization, if one can use that term, an age in which there was a great deal of mobility at all levels. And these sportsmen were part of this extraordinarily global world. And I think it was a short-lived moment, because after 1914, that mobility was curtailed in very significant ways. So it was also a unique conjuncture in global history. So these three elements of the global were sort of increasingly became an important element of my story. I finally want to end with one point, which is also about the way in which the global sort of was significant in the way I wrote this book. And that is that I decided to write this book as a narrative, as a story, which made it quite complicated in some ways, because every time, when you decide to tell a story, there are all kinds of analytical choices about what to put in and what to leave out. But the thing that struck me as I was writing it was that most global histories tend to focus on the macro, and they're about the big story, they're about big process. But I wanted to write a global history in which the micro would have an important place. So the book, in a sense, can be read as a global history, but it's also a global history told through a lot of local histories. I think I'll end on that point.
Thank you, Prashant. It was so interesting to hear how your research has taken the book beyond your original intentions. And I have to say, for me, the combination of the personal stories with the imperial context was really gripping. So thank you to all four of our speakers. They are fascinating books, and I'm sure that anyone in the audience who hasn't already read them or got hold of them will want to know that there are signed copies of each 4 books available through Fox Lane Books, and there's a reference to that website in the chat. So I can see we've got a couple of questions from the audience. Please do add in questions. But if I may, I'll start with one of my own. So I was really inspired by all of you in terms of your wide use of sources. In David's book, you use an incredible range of archival, archaeological, folkloric, legend, and oral history. And it was wonderful to see how you mesh them together. And Toby, you spoke when you spoke just now about the sources, and you also tell us about an incident in your introduction where you heard somebody sort of muttering something that then triggered you to think about different kinds of sources and cultural memories. So I would just be interested in hearing a bit more from you all about your use of sources, and particularly what are the challenges in using what are considered less traditional historical sources, certainly since I was a student. And would you say that other historians are doing the same as you in terms of a range of approaches to the evidence? We start with perhaps David and then Toby.
Yes, it's a very important, very interesting question. I particularly enjoy using archaeological source material. I'm not an archaeologist. I don't have that sort of training. And some of the parts of the world I was dealing with are still relatively undeveloped when it comes to archaeology. So there's a challenge there, really, in getting access to the material one wants. What I found particularly exciting with maritime history was the extraordinary work that's now been done on shipwrecks. So we know so much more about, for instance, the spice trade, when these amazing shipwrecks, one of them with 500,000 pieces of Chinese porcelain from the early Middle Ages, discovered off the coasts of Indonesia. So that is really expanding our horizons. The big challenge for global history is going to be how historians who've been trained, I think my Latin is good, I can just about manage with ancient Greek and so on, but I don't have Chinese, I don't have Japanese. So, and there was source material in languages which actually very few people know, Malayalam, which is a South Indian language, but very important material in that. So are we going to rely on translations? And that's not really the way to get to know the sources properly. I think there's a real issue there that we haven't quite faced up to yet.
Yes, I would agree with David fundamentally on that. questions of language and linguistics and the amount of time it takes, to really come to grips with a number of languages which you need to come to grips with if you're going to write a genuinely global history. And even, of course, in West Africa, there are so many different West African languages. I can understand and speak to a degree reasonably well 2 or 3, but that's just touching a very small element. I think that touches on another issue, which is, of course, the pressure of time and the difficulties in a world where we're deluged with information, and administering that information takes up more and more of everybody's time. That the time that it was required to do this work is another significant issue. But I think that the opportunity of using a diversity of sources, I think, is really is foremost, really, because especially with the oral histories that I use in the book, what those really do for me as a historian, and in terms of the reading experience, I would say, of the book, is produce a different discourse and a different perspective, and provide that West African perspective on historical experiences which other sources simply can't provide, and that's one of the, and in terms of hoping that global histories can produce that different kind of perspective, it's only really, I think, if we go outside of the traditional source base that we can begin to do that. It depends, of course, on the period you're working with. Prashant, for example, you're working with a much more recent period of time, so the types of source you will use. But again, that's the same process of reading those sources and how they offer different perspective, I think, is shared with all of us. And I would say, again, with Marion, I think a historian of West Africa and a medievalist often share quite a lot in terms of our uses of sources.
Yeah, I think that I really enjoyed just doing a variety of different kinds of things in the book. And there were times when I was working on the book when I thought, is it okay that I've got sections which are about me going somewhere that Chaucer went to, and sections that are about philosophy, and sections that are about literary criticism, and all these different things. And then eventually I was like, well, okay, I'm gonna write the book I want to write, and hopefully other people will like it as well. And I found that really interesting, just being able to think about objects and spaces, as well as poems, as well as the documentary records, and look at a whole range of different kinds of things. And I suppose, just in terms of also one thing that I found very helpful with source was that there's a huge volume of Chaucer life records, which has been around for a long time, and many people have used. And then when you take each of those records and take it out of that volume and put it back into its original context, and try and look at all the other things that were happening around that time, I found that incredibly useful and valuable, because often people had already told a narrative by putting together this volume of these records all go together. And then you actually try and take them back to where they came from, and think about what other ways we might think about those records, so that, for instance, taking the safe conduct for Navarre, which I talked about, where I then went back to the Chancellery of Navarre records and looked at all the other things that were happening on the day that Chaucer got that safe conduct, for instance. It gives you this whole other world. So, again, the languages for me are not as daunting as the range that some of the others need to look at. But for all of us, I think you do need lots of languages, and everyone should be studying lots more languages than they do. I know I should.
Yes, here to the study of more languages. There's a related question in the chat from Alex Hibberts. In producing a global history, how have you balanced the wider view and the unique aspects of each region? And I'd like to ask David to answer that, and Prashant as well.
Yes, that's a very important question. If I were to go back to actually the previous book I wrote about the Mediterranean, what in a sense got me started on the particular approach that I've adopted in that book and in The Boundless Sea as well, was a sort of feeling that so many maritime histories actually ended up being histories of the lands around the edges. And what it seems to me one can do, and this is very relevant to how we approach global history, we have to think in terms of the connections. That's really what is absolutely central to the way that we approach approach global history. I mean, there's another argument that the comparative dimension is really important and so on. If you're writing a global history of the Middle Ages, you should include Aztecs and Incas. But the problem is that the Aztecs had nothing really to do with the Incas, and certainly had nothing to do with the Europeans or the Africans or the Chinese or the Japanese and so on. So I think by trying actually as a sort of maritime historian to concentrate on the sea, and by that I don't mean sort of nautical technology, I don't mean even the experience of sailors crossing the sea, but who crosses the sea and why, what they're trying to do when they cross the sea, what merchants and monks and all the other sorts of people whom we find crossing the oceans, that actually gives one a certain degree. You can create a sort of unity out of that, but it is a challenge, and I recognize, that there are other ways of writing the history of I mean, Atlantic history, Mediterranean history, and so on. Of course, there are other ways of doing it than mine, but it seems to me that emphasizing those connections is really a very useful way forward.
Right. Could I just answer the question about sources too, and then come to this point? I agree with all the points that were made by David, Toby, and Marion. I would say that, in a sense, I think the question of sources becomes very important for global history, because I think increasingly you're seeing that global historians are eschewing the older tradition of relying purely on synthetic works for other regions and then drawing on that and putting together a story. I think there's an increasing sense that you do need to know the debates around the primary sources for these regions and so on, and then you must steep yourself in those sources. I think in my own case, one of the things I knew very clearly that by the time I started doing the research, that there was very little scope for oral history, as it were. Most of the people who were associated with the project were long dead and so on. So I knew it was going to be largely newspapers, because the colonial official record on this tour was fairly thin, because the colonial establishment in India wasn't really into sort of organizing these tours and so on. It was a private venture. But over and beyond that, it very quickly became, as the research progressed and as the themes began to evolve, and I knew that this was a much larger story, it became very clear that my approach would have to be a bit like that of a scrap collector, who just collects everything and works with, nothing can be discounted, and it's only in the writing that you begin to see what might become significant and what. And of course, that imposes its own costs, because at each moment, you have to evaluate whether something is useful or not. And in my case, I proceeded on the assumption that everything was possibly useful, which is probably not a very efficient way of doing one's research. But because the last thing you want when you're writing a chapter is to suddenly realize that there was something you could have looked at, but you disregarded, and now you can't go back to it. So that was as far as the sources go. But I agree completely that one needs to be able to work with different languages and have a very open mind about the whole range of sources one can look at. And in my case, it was also, when I started the research, the newspaper, this digitization of newspapers had not really taken off. So I spent a lot of time going through these newspapers by microfilm, and sort of, that took a lot of time. And the research became, as I started writing the book, a lot of this stuff started getting digitized. So cross-checking it became much easier later on. But as regards this question of the wide angle and the specific regional one, I think that often it is a question of what it is, what perspective you're telling the story from. So for example, when I began, I didn't really think I would need to know that much about British history, because this was a story of an Indian cricket team. But as I began to do the research and as the structure of the book began to emerge in my head, I realized I would need to know a lot about Edwardian history for me to be able to make sense of what was going on in that summer and so on. So so the British element, history element, because in most sports history books, the kind of things that I deal with in my book, the local context in different parts of Britain, Scottish cricket and Irish cricket, that would have been regarded as the backdrop, whereas for me, it became very central to know these different elements. And so I think it's very much a question of perspective, and what is the center, what is the periphery. I think it depends very much on the perspective from which you're approaching it, and those perspectives change as the research progresses and as one begins to write, I think.
Thank you, Prashant. I think we have got one more question, but unless Laura allows it, and perhaps when she comes back in, we are due to wind up. I think that end note of what is the perspective, is it the centre or the periphery, from which perspective, is a really good note to end on. So Marion, Toby, Prashant, David, thank you so much, not just for tonight, but for writing such amazing books that we can all enjoy and learn a huge amount from. It's been a really wonderful chat. It's time now to hand over back to Laura.
I think this has been an enormously enriching evening, and I'm sure that all of the people in the audience are as excited as I am to hear about the approaches that you're using to figures that we think we're familiar with, such as Chaucer, but parts of the world that maybe we don't know so much about as we ought to do. And I think if Mark Armroad were here, if I'm bold enough to speak for him, then I think he'd be amazed at the ambition of the work that you have completed, and he would really want to talk to you about the sources and the evidence that you're using and how you're using it. And so I think this would have been a wonderful, wonderful evening had he been able to join us. I want to congratulate all of you on being shortlisted for the prize. And of course, I particularly want to congratulate the 2020 prize winner, David Abulafia. The Boundless Sea is BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week next week, broadcasting from Monday, the 30th of November. So I think we'll all be tuning into that. Just a reminder about another event you might be interested in. Tomorrow at 6:30, we have The Rise of the Valkyrie, Mythical and Real Woman of the Viking World, with a speaker from the National Library of Norway. Why were these powerful beings female, and what do they tell us about Viking society? So I think that'll be a great talk, and we look forward to all of you joining us. All that remains for me to say is to thank all of our speakers, Prashant, Toby, David and Marion, and of course to Rayanne for chairing this event, and to Paul and the Wolfson Prize. I also want to thank the people behind the scenes at the University of York events team. They've made this evening possible. And last but not least, I want to thank you, the audience, for your questions and for listening. Thank you very much, and goodbye from the University of York.